Hi there and welcome to today's video. So with our 2024 season now behind us, I thought it'd be good to take a moment to sort of recap on the season, have a think about what went well, what didn't go well, and what we learned on our first year on Hat-Trick. So without further ado, let's dive straight into it and let's start off with the goals for 2024. So our stated goal, as in just to go sailing, was to reach the Isle of Skye, and obviously we did achieve that this year. Now the Isle of Skye has been a sort of long-term objective right back from when we had sort of Salty, and it always seemed like this kind of incredibly far distance that we'd never achieve, and then it was kind of a surreal experience, and I think I talked about in the video where we sort of sailed out of Malik, and next thing I'm sort of like, wait, that's Skye right there. I could drop the anchor right now and jump in the dinghy and go to it, and we're that close, and it kind of almost snuck up on us in terms of succeeding. Obviously the true test was stepping foot on Skye, and we went to Portree, so we kind of technically achieved it, but as we sort of said in that video, we didn't exactly see the best of Skye. Skye has some beautiful sort of natural, relatively secluded locations to explore, and Portree, as pretty a little town as it is, isn't one of those. So like I say, we kind of jokingly did the video about we went to Skye and it sucked, which offended a lot of people based on the use of the word sucked randomly, but it wasn't to say that Skye is a bad place to visit or that we felt sort of let down by it. We just didn't go to the places that we would have loved to have seen. Hopefully next year we'll address that. One of the things about sailing, which I kind of love, I guess, is that the horizon keeps expanding as your sort of experience and adventurousness does as well. So it's kind of weird to say for a long time Skye was this place that's out of reach, and now it's kind of feels like a stopping off point potentially to further places, which is a kind of great feeling, as I say, to feel your world expand as you sort of sail further and further. So yeah, hopefully we'll go a bit further this year and visit some new places, but yeah, ticking Skye off the list is a pretty great achievement. So now let's talk about the boat. So obviously this was our first year sailing on Hat-Trick, second year that we've owned her, and yeah, it was a big step up from sort of Salty to Leisure 23. I think, as I said many times, Hat-Trick sails very well. She's very efficient through the water, will travel quite well on light winds and light sails. In terms of my sort of concerns over her, I'm someone who suffers a bit from rig fear, or at least what I call rig fear. I can't kind of shake this thought in my head that at any moment the mast is just going to get ripped off the boat and just the lines are all going to snap and it's just going to be a catastrophe. And I don't have any particular reason to think that on this boat. All the rigging seems to be in good condition. There's no obvious signs of sort of deterioration or damage. I don't know when the rigging was last done, probably a very long time ago. I had the same feeling on Salty, and I ended up getting Salty re-rigged. That cost about £1,000. I predict that if I was to get Hat-Trick re-rigged, I'd be in the sort of £3,000–4,000, which isn't really feasible at the moment. So at the end of next season, if all goes to plan, I'll probably be taking the mast down for various other reasons beyond needing to do it, but obviously while it's down, that's a great chance to properly go over the rigging and get it looked at if I find anything that's of concern. But yeah, so that's partly why we haven't pushed the sails as much as I'm sure many people watching would think that you could, because I'm always just a little bit paranoid about that. And also we're learning the boat. I don't know what too much wind for full sail is on this boat, and I'd rather err on the side of caution and keep her on a smaller reef, even if it's not necessary. So that brings us on to the reefing. So we've had our mainsail reefing set up sort of incorrectly, and lots of people pointed that out, particularly early in the season. When we came back for the return journey, where we went through the Crinan, we did actually adjust it, because by then the beginning videos of the season had been out, people had commented on it, so we were kind of aware at that point that things were wrong. The problem was when I reset the reefing lines up based on sort of comments from people, I discovered that the lines aren't long enough, so I think I'm going to end up having to replace those reefing lines this winter. just so we can get that working properly. I also want to do something about the front. The way that the front of the mainsail is reefed is quite awkward and requires a lot of sort of back and forth, you know, up onto the deck, which is obviously not great, particularly if you're in some sort of extreme winds and you're trying to desperately reduce your sail area. So I want to do some work on that as well, and hopefully, you know, hopefully that'll make it a bit easier to use the mainsail. So, you know, next season we'll get more use out of it, because I'm aware that we were sort of heavily over rigged or relying on the head sail, you know, not the mainsail, more than we probably should have been. But you know, again, we're learning, so I'm relatively comfortable with where we went with the sailing this year. I also have a problem with the roller reefing on the head sail. I don't want to kind of go too much into it, because I assume some of you will know this and this will be boring, and others probably don't care. But if you imagine that, you know, you've got the drum on the bottom of the sail, and as I pull the sail out, that basically wraps rope around that drum, and then when I pull that rope out, it basically rolls the sail back up. Now, the problem is that you've got to get the line on that drum relatively accurate, in terms of, you know, if you've not got enough line, you won't be able to pull the sail all the way out, because, you know, it runs to the back of the boat and then into a stopper, and it'll hit the stopper before the sail's all the way out. So you've got to have enough line to let the sail all the way out, but not too much line that it kind of overfills the drum, and because it's kind of an enclosed drum, it then jams the drum up. You also have to, you know, when you're putting the sail out and in, you have to sort of get the right level of tension, so that, you know, the line feeds sort of tightly and smoothly onto the drum. If it's too loose, it'll just bind up again and all get tangled up in there. So it's been a bit of a pain getting just that kind of balance, so that, you know, I can get the sail in and out. And what tends to happen is, you know, when I'm pulling the sail out, the rope gets jammed up, or likewise when I'm pulling the sail in, it gets jammed up, and then often I have to go up to the front and adjust it and things like that, and it's just a bit of a faff. So it's just kind of a fundamental issue with these systems, I think. But the rope in the furling line is very old. I think it's probably the original, so it's quite stiff, and it's not got much give in it and things like that, and it's quite frictiony. So I think I'll replace that line with a new one, and see if that sort of improves the situation next year. You know, it's not the end of the world. Again, it's just a bit of a faff. Obviously, any assessment of the boat wouldn't be complete without talking about the engine. Obviously, the start of the season was pretty tricky with the engine. You know, we had the sort of failed to start at Tiana Bruin. I had the propeller issues at the Norfolk Butte, and then I also had the failing to start on my way down to Campbelltown. I think the two failing to starts were actually just down to the stop thing getting stuck, but I can't go back and verify that. But that's kind of a thing, because, you know, after those incidents, the engine, touch wood, ran perfectly for the rest of the season. You know, she burned a little bit of oil, but she's probably a 25-30-year-old two-cylinder crappy diesel engine. It's not surprising that she's burning a little bit of oil, or maybe even, you know, leaking a bit of oil. She holds 2.5 litres of oil, which I guess is about half a gallon. And I would say that she burned probably a couple of litres over the whole season, which we did quite a lot of motoring. So probably 120 hours, something like that. So, you know, I don't think that's actually too bad. And obviously, as long as I keep an eye on it, keep sort of topping her up and measuring her and making sure that, you know, it's staying consistent, then I'm not too overly concerned. You know, I've talked about before, I would love to replace the engine, but it's just not on the cards. You know, like I say, I could replace it with something crappy for probably half the price of the boat, or I could replace it with something new, or at least relatively new, for essentially more than the boat cost, which, yeah, neither of which are really possible right now. So yeah, we'll see how she goes next season. Obviously, you'll winterize her and then service her before next season, and we'll see how we get on with her, and just fingers crossed that she keeps on chugging. Significant thing is every British person's favourite topic, the weather. Now, it's not an exaggeration to say that this was probably one of the worst summers we've had in a while, and that's saying something, because we often have a lot of bad summers. You know, looking back through the footage, I think it actually looks nicer on the footage than it was in reality. A couple of reasons for this. Number one, you know, you only get to see really micro snapshots, and we try and obviously put together a story that sort of shows you the journey we went through on those sort of few days that the video covers. But, you know, bear in mind that you're seeing 72 to maybe 96 hours of our lives compressed into 15 to 20 minutes. You're missing a lot. Obviously, you know, it wouldn't be entertaining for us just to film ourselves 24 hours a day and put that out there. And that means you get a slightly kind of skewed view of things like the weather, for example, whereby, you know, when it's cold, wet and miserable, sometimes we don't feel like, you know, filming as much. So you might not see that. Also, if we're just kind of slogging along in miserable weather and it's grey and overcast and everything looks miserable, then, you know, the inclination to point a camera at it is less. So, but I think more so, you know, I think looking back through it, we had a lot of nice days. Well, sorry, we had a lot of days that weren't awful, like it wasn't hammering it down with rain or stormy. You know, you had some blue skies, you had some sunshine, but it just never got warm last summer. You know, looking back, I remember on the trip from Lochranza to Campbelltown before it got really stormy as I got down towards Campbelltown, you know, it started off as a beautiful day to the point I even, you know, revealed my pasty body for a little bit to the sunshine. That was the last time that I took my top off, I think. And I'm not saying that, and that sounds a bit like OnlyFansy, but as a kind of indication of the temperature, you know, it never got to that point where you just felt comfortable. I think there was only a couple of days where you will have seen us in a t-shirt as opposed to, you know, jumpers, thermals, sailing overcoats, you know, just never got up to sort of comfortable temperatures. You know, I think, and we talk about it on one of the videos, you know, mid-June it was 9 degrees when we left. I think we were heading to the Skye Bridge that day, and it was a cold, wet and miserable day, and I say it was 9 degrees in the middle of summer. That ain't summer temperatures. You know, it could have been a lot worse. You know, we had a couple of different storms, you know, but, you know, I'm not kind of looking a gift horse in the mouth to a degree. We did get to achieve our goals. We did get to sail everywhere. Yes, it was, you know, wrapped up to the nines as opposed to, you know, in shorts and t-shirt. But, you know, there's every chance that when we set off next year that, you know, we might not get out of the Clyde. You know, there's every possibility the weather could be that bad. So I'm not complaining too much, but yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice if next year was at least a little bit warmer, shall we say. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about the crew. So I'm going to start off with Jo, who I guess first mate for the boat, although I think she kind of refers to herself as passenger plus. Now, I think it's fair to say that it was a relatively tough one for Jo. We've talked about it a bit, and she, you know, she did enjoy it. There were some real highlights and some real great memories, but it was a tough one. You know, I think mainly centered around the weather for Jo. As we've covered at length on the videos, Jo doesn't do well in the cold. She sort of wraps up as much as she can, but it just, I don't know, she's part lizard or something, and she just gets really cold really easily. Obviously, if it's wet a lot of the time, you know, that adds to the coldness. And it's just, yeah, it's just hard to enjoy any experience when you're shivering and cold and just generally feeling pretty crappy about things. Jo also struggles in rough conditions, which I'm not claiming that I don't. A lot of people do. I think that's mainly just an experience thing. You know, this first time she's, you know, this year I think has experienced anything like rough conditions. You know, we had a couple of rough moments in Salty. But, you know, going across when we went north from Mallaig, for example, the waves were quite big out of there, plus a couple of the sort of bits, you know, out of the Skye Bridge and stuff like that, you know, and the crossing from Rona to Portree. You know, there were some, you know, pretty decent sized waves. You know, Hattrick's 30 foot, she's pretty capable, but she's not a giant boat, so she still does get tossed around a little bit. And Jo has just never done anything like that before in her life. So I don't think it's that unreasonable that she's a little bit nervous and not keen on the idea of rough sailing. You know, and it's important to remember that, you know, realistically this is my hobby, not Jo's. So she's kind of, she wants to come and I think she does enjoy it, but she does to a certain degree kind of get dragged along with me on these adventures. So I have to sort of take that into account in what we're doing. You know, I'm not claiming that I'm some super adventurer like Eric Andreas, is it? I can never get his name, that guy's epic, goes out into the North Sea in the middle of winter just to see what a Force 10 is like, I think somewhere in my brain I kind of wish I was like that, but then if I'm honest with myself, I'm not. And I get nervous and find it difficult when it's difficult conditions. I think I'm capable of sort of keeping it together and get me through it, but it is a challenge, and so Joe is sort of way behind me in terms of experience, both in terms of managing the boat, but in terms of just experiencing those kind of conditions. So it's perfectly fine that she's finds it a struggle, and ultimately as kind of skipper, I guess, of the boat, I have to balance Joe's experience in terms of sort of pushing the limits and going out into these sort of wild, adventurous conditions, and the recognition that this is supposed to be a holiday. This is our one break from work each year, and yeah, it's a decent break, and certainly very grateful for it. But we don't want to spend the entire 6-7 weeks just terrified and getting battered and miserable, and we want to enjoy the experience, and if that means sitting out a storm in a marina with a nice cold beer, well, that sounds a bit better than punishing ourselves and slogging through stuff. But like I say, you've got to balance that with pushing ourselves and growing our confidence. And I know for a fact that Joe's confidence this year grew so much, and I'm sure it'll take her a little bit to find her feet again next season. But I think that if she can kind of live through the weather that we had this year, particularly say the cold and wet conditions constantly, I'm just crossing everything that we get slightly better on next year. And if we do, I think she'll do really well, and I think her confidence will keep growing. Joe's one of these people who is the last person to recognise her abilities and how great she is, essentially. But yeah, hopefully, like I say, if next season we get a little bit better weather, I think that'll do us wonders, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, next on the crew manifest is the most important member of crew, Skylar. Now, obviously being a dog, it's harder to kind of communicate with her as to what's going on in her head. Also, it's kind of hard with Skylar because, she is essentially a princess who lives in a sort of state of perpetual disgruntlement. I remember once I had a toilet roll, because she likes to play with toilet rolls, and I blew a raspberry down it at her. Not like right next to her, she was couple of steps back, and I didn't do it. It was like, it wasn't like even really loud. I don't think Skylar would look at me for a week after that. So this is kind of the level of put outness that Skylar will exhibit. So dragging her onto the boat can be it's quite the put out for her. She loves being with us, essentially. Like at the end of the day, I think as long as she's with us, she's quote unquote happy. I think she she loves the outdoors. She loves just watching the world go by. And obviously there's always something to look at, there's always something to sniff on the air, there's always a bird flying by to stare at and wish you could chase. She loves the dinghy and going to shore and all the places she gets to go for a run around and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of positives for it. She doesn't love the rough weather, which is kind of understandable. It must be quite daunting as to what the hell's going on for her. She kind of has a little hole that she hides in the 3/4 berth. I'd like to turn it into something comfy and nice for her. Maybe even make like a little, almost like a kennel at the back there that's all padded so she can go in there. But she doesn't like it when you try and do stuff for her. I remember doing it on Salty where she would crawl underneath where, if it had an inboard engine, the inboard engine would be, and she'd crawl into this fiberglass space underneath there when it got rough. And so one day I thought, well, I'll put her dog bed under there. At least she isn't lying on the cold fiberglass, she can just lie in her bed under there. I looked under her a bit later on and she was crunched up in the corner to avoid lying in her bed. I don't know why she won't be helped, but so at the end of the day we just kind of leave her to it. If she's found a spot that she feels comfortable in when it's rough weather, then fine. It'll be interesting to see how she gets on next year. She is getting quite old now. By the time we go sailing next year, I think she'll be over 12. She's doing all right, touch wood, for herself at the moment. She's still, pretty sprightly, pretty happy, still loves to go out for a walk, but we do find that if she has any kind of hard exercise or a long walk, then she will sort of be a bit limpy the next few days. The boat itself is a little bit awkward. She loves kind of going around, and you'll have seen her constantly going up to the front and things like that. I think for next year we'll probably look at putting netting on the guardrails for her. She's, like I say, she's still okay, but another year of deterioration, and she's a little bit less stable on her feet. And obviously, you know, moving on the boat, it's easy to get jostled around, and obviously we don't want her going overboard. So I think we did talk about doing it this year, but didn't get around to it. And as it turned out, I think she was fine with it. But it is something I'll probably need to consider for next year. The other thing is inside the boat is quite difficult for her. You know, coming in and out of the hatch, there's, you know, some really steep steps, and she's kind of okay going up them, I think, but coming down she tends to slam down pretty hard on her front legs, and those are the ones that are suffering for her. So we're going to get to a point where she's going to have to basically be lifted around the boat a little bit, but that's fine. That's just something we need to keep an eye on it. The more awkward one is the bedroom. She sleeps with us, as you've probably seen. She is generally pretty good of sort of, once she gets into bed, she'll just sort of stay there, but sometimes she gets a bit unsettled, or sometimes she decides she wants to get up and go for a drink or something, and it's quite the jump down from the bed for her. And again, she's landing onto them front paws really hard, which is probably not doing her joints any good. And then likewise, the jump up for her is pretty tough. She can do it, but I can see a time coming where she misses it and falls backwards and could end up hurting herself or something. So again, that's something we need to consider. I'm not sure if there's anything I can do there to create something that will make it easier for her to get up and down it, and knowing what she's like, even if I do, she'll probably refuse to use it. But yeah, you know, she's getting to be an old dog. It's a tough time that comes in any dog owner's life, but you know, I think she's had a wonderful life one way or another, and you know, we're going to hopefully keep her with us, you know, keep bringing her on the boat for as long as we can. But yeah, it's just something that we need to be a little bit aware of, that she's not the puppy, despite what we call her, anymore. And yeah, we're just going to have to be a little bit more sensitive. And again, it comes down to why I can't, you know, maybe push quite as much as, at least in my head, sat here, I think I would on my own, or, you know, or with, you know, a crew member who's, you know, more experienced and more confident. You know, I don't want to make Skylar feel miserable all the time. I don't want her to be scared stiff all the time. But like I say, you know, in general, I think Skylar just wants to be with us, and you know, while she'd probably prefer to be at home with us, I think she's okay with us on the boat. Last, I guess I could say by no means least, but maybe it is least, is myself. I think you know, in general, I think I did okay. There were certainly some challenges for me this year, and there were certainly some really low points. The time I spent on anchor with the propeller issue in Norfolk Butte was a genuinely quite scary and traumatic experience. Also, likewise, you know, with the engine failure on the way down to Campbelltown, that was also a big knock to the confidence, and, you know, put me in a pretty bad place. You know, my fears are, it's funny, my fears aren't necessarily that, you know, I'm going to die or the boat's going to sink. You know, I don't genuinely think there's much chance of that. I think the worst thing that could happen would be, you know, something like, say, getting demasted and the mast coming down on my head. Obviously that would be pretty catastrophic. But in terms of like the boat sinking or something like that, or getting swamped in rough weather, I mean, I'm not that far out to sea. I have good communication connections with lifeguard and other people. You know, I've got a dinghy. Like, you know, the odds, you know, if something went really badly, you know, I don't feel like I would be in that much danger. I'm not dismissing the fact I could be, but that's not where my fear comes from. I think my fear comes from being a nuisance, essentially. You know, having to drag people out to come tow me in, or, you know, ending up on the rocks and, you know, making a big environmental mess. I'm insured and all that, so in theory it would all get covered that, you know, but the financial implications of problems and mistakes also bear pretty hard. So yeah, I tend to be maybe more cautious than I need to be, but, you know, this is serious stuff. You know, it is fun, it's beautiful, but, you know, being out on a boat is a serious commitment and it's a serious undertaking, and I think, you know, it's right that I do take it seriously. So yeah, so, you know, like I say, some tough points during the season, But ultimately, you know, I did set out and achieve what I kind of wanted to achieve. You know, I took the boat around the Mulligan Tyre on my own, which, you know, was a great achievement and a huge thing to do, I think, at least for me. You know, we did get all the way up to Skye, and boat, crew, everything came back in one piece. So I mean, I think, you know, I've right to feel a little bit of pride as to how I got on this season, even if, you know, I didn't necessarily do it with cheer and bravado at every step of the way. You know, on that front, you know, I talked a bit about the sales side of things, you know, and I certainly have work to do on sort of that side of it, and my confidence in that regard, and my learning around the boat. You know, I know for a fact that people are sat there watching, thinking, you know, why have you got that sail reef so much in light winds? You know, I know that because I think that when I sit there editing it, you know, or you'll sort of see us motoring and talking about how the wind's not right, but then you can kind of see like the wind turbine spinning and the flags sort of flapping, and you're like, well, there clearly is wind. The winds up here can be very changeable and gusty, and obviously if we're doing, say, an 8-hour trip and you're seeing, I don't know, 6 minutes of footage from that 8-hour trip, let's say, you're not necessarily getting the full picture. You know, just because we're sort of sat there, you know, in light winds with a heavily reefed sail, that doesn't mean that a little bit ago it wasn't quite rough or stronger winds, or that we're not kind of bracing for the fact that there might be stronger winds down the line. Again, maybe that's a confidence thing where I'm like, well, I don't want to put the mainsail up and then get hit by a massive gust. I don't know if you remember when we left and went north from Mallock, we were sailing, and I was actually about to put the mainsail up actually, but I hadn't got around to it, and 5 minutes later we got hit by this, what must have been a 40-mile-an-hour sort of plus gust, really, really, really strong stuff, you know. And had I had sort of the full main out and the full head thing out, it would have been quite a scary ordeal, I think. And so that kind of decision-making process is going through our head as well. So there are reasons why, or legitimate reasons that I'd kind of defend as to why we're maybe a little bit, you know, overcautious with the sails. But at the end of the day, the criticism is perfectly valid. You know, I don't have a huge amount of confidence, you know, in myself, and as I said, in the rigging and things like that, and that leads me to an abundance of overcaution. But again, I'm not going to beat myself up about it too much. You know, at the end of the day, if we're going in the right direction and we're moving at a reasonable pace, it's going to get us there when we need to. I'm not a racer. I don't feel the need to squeeze in as a half a knot and knot out at speed out the boat. But if I make some changes to the reefing lines, and, you know, hopefully next year we might, you know, might be a little bit more confident in that regard. So I guess it's time for a verdict on the season. I think in general, maybe looking back with a little bit of rose-tinted spectacles, but I think it was a really good first season for us. You know, despite the weather, despite the conditions, we kind of did everything we wanted to do. We saw some beautiful places, we had some beautiful times, we built a lot of confidence, and it didn't put us off sailing. You know, which is always a fear. You know, I think I said that back in the solo days, well, what if I do come out and do 3 weeks of this and realise I hate sailing, particularly on my own. So yeah, it left us pretty good, and you know, and I'm quite looking forward to next year, and just, yeah, hopefully pushing out and achieving even more. Yeah, obviously, as I say, making it to the Isle of Skye was an anticlimax at the time, but something that I genuinely feel quite proud of. And I think, you know, particularly Joe and Skyler should feel proud of as well, because, you know, there's a lot of bigger boats here in RB that don't go that far every year. So I think it's something that I always say to Joe and try and remind myself of is, you know, to give ourselves credit where credit's due. You know, going around the Mulligan Tyre in Salty, a Leisure 23 in the middle of the night, you know, and arriving at gear where every other boat is twice our length. You know, that's not nothing, you know, and feeling a bit nervous and a bit, you know, concerned about it. Yeah, well, obviously. But I think it's easy to think that we're kind of being cowards and wusses and not really pushing the envelope when, you know, there's certainly people who push the envelope way beyond what we do, and certainly braver people than us. I'm not suggesting that we're the bravest sailors out there, but I also don't think that we're maybe quite the cowards that sometimes we judge ourselves as. So yeah, I think, like I say, I think, you know, a a reasonable pat on the back is warranted from our performance this season. Obviously, we're out of the water now, so we'll be going into maintenance videos for the next few, but it shouldn't be actually that long until we are starting the 2025 season. We're obviously quite far behind in terms of putting the videos out, so I'm not sure on the exact timescales as to when you'll be seeing this, but I would probably expect to see a few maintenance videos coming up after this. And then we'll, hopefully be getting straight into 2025. Won't talk about plans for 2025, as I say, not formalised yet, and who knows what's going to happen with the weather. We'll deal with that when we get closer to the time. And just a bit of sort of YouTube admin-y stuff. Obviously, you know, everyone says subscribe, like, comment and all that. Really would appreciate it, particularly, I say, if you're looking forward to how our next season goes, then subscribing is a way to make sure you know. YouTube we went to weekly videos for a while to catch up, and then when we did that, YouTube seemed to sort of punish the channel, and the views just dropped like a stone to like 30% of what they were before. Who knows why, YouTube's algorithm and all. So yeah, anything, you know, if you like the stuff and you want us to keep using it, then anything you can do to kind of push it. We do now have a buy a coffee thing. Joe deals with it, so I'm not really sure what it is. You know, we've never asked for donations, anything like that, but it is there. And, you know, as I said, it's expensive to do this. It's getting more expensive, and our ability to afford to do it is, you know, it's becoming more of a challenge. Don't expect you guys to help solve that problem. That's our problem. But if you do appreciate what we've done with the videos and you do like watching them, and most importantly you can spare it or can afford it, then there is an option there for you to help out with a few of the many bills that come out of Hat-Trick. But like I say, that, you know, we're not making these videos because we expect it to make us money or become big celebrities or anything like that. We make them because they're our memories, they're our sort of history of what we've done. And like I say, you know, assuming I live long enough to become old and delirious, I will no doubt really enjoy looking back at these times. So like I say, options there if you want to use it, but as I say, just being here watching the videos is all we ask. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Hopefully you found this relatively interesting. Nice to take a moment to give you some more in-depth stuff. But yeah, as I say, like, subscribe, all that if you fancy it. And most of all, guys, we'll see you in the next one.